Please join me in welcoming back Richard Branch.
Morning, everybody. Thanks, Kathy. Hope everybody's doing well. So like Kathy said, I've been following the construction space for about 14 years at Dodge, another 16 once I finished grad school way back in 1997. So I've seen a lot of cycles in the construction space, right? A lot of ups and downs. I left my position at Dodge back in January, and just since January, how much has changed in the industry, right? Trade policy, immigration policy, a lot has shifted. And what I'm going to try to do here over the next half an hour, 40 minutes or so, is kind of guide you through what I think is going to happen in non-residential building. Now, I think it's very easy to get sucked into doom and gloom, right? There's a lot of crappy news out there. But how many people were here in the industry or in metals or in construction back, say, during the global financial crisis or the Great Recession? Yeah, a good chunk of you. It ain't that bad, right? And I think for those of you that were around during the Great Recession and the global financial crisis, even within the non-residential building space, there were a lot of sectors that actually survived and thrived. K through 12 is a great example of a very large sector of the construction space that actually grew quite nicely during the Great Recession. So if I could give you maybe just a piece of advice even before we get into slide number 2, stop watching the news. Just stop. Whether your poison of choice is CNN or Fox or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, just give it up, right? Because you're missing the vast majority of the story. And what I'm hoping here today to show you the good, the bad, and the ugly within the non-residential space is to help you find some of the leading indicators, some of the drivers that I think are pushing construction. Because again, I don't think it's all doom and gloom. If you look at what's happening in business, in the business world, businesses are feeling business confidence is at a pretty near record low. Most of it's just due to the uncertainty. They're uncertain of how they can pass tariffs through to the end user. You can see that between the difference between the CPI and the PPI that came out this week. PPI showed a decline, CPI showed a rise. They're confused. And in order to protect their margins, right now they're not aggressively pushing prices forward to consumers, but in order to protect margins and profitability, what are they doing? They're cutting jobs. And so what you have then is weakening consumer confidence. Now, the economy could certainly turn out better. I'm not forecasting a recession here. I think the economy hits a low in maybe Q1 of 2026. So we're going to steadily decelerate. Q1, those interest rate cuts start to take impact in the economy. I think the Fed cuts another couple of times in 2026, gets us back to around 3% in the Fed funds rate, which is about the equilibrium rate. And by the time we're in the second half of 2026, you're going to start to see the economy pick up speed again. But I think the worst of what we saw, say, back in 2019 or 2018, because of the fact that commercial construction, non-residential construction is subdued, we won't see these massive price increases that we saw back in the first trade war. I also think there's reason to believe when you look at what construction companies are doing, they've already started to diversify their supply chain. If you go back again to 2018 and you look at the China line, that's when those tariffs really started to kick in on China in his first term. Look at what people did. They shifted to lower cost areas. And we've really seen that pick up this year as tariffs started to kick in on Canada and Mexico. So what is this telling us? I think this tells us that construction companies are proving themselves to be much, much more agile in terms of protecting their supply chains than they were back during his first term. So again, I think this forestalls some of that worsening inflationary impact we might see on material prices in the construction space. So back to the title of the presentation, I don't know if this is good, but at the very least, I don't think it's ugly, right? It certainly is going to cut projects at the margin, but I think overall, I'll use the word, I think this is very manageable for the construction space, especially as we start to see rate cuts kick in later in the year. So if there's a theme as we go through the rest of the presentation is that construction market's becoming more and more bifurcated. Actually, it could be even trifurcated, if that's a word, between the haves, the maybes, and the have-nots. I mentioned at the outset, you need to understand the leading indicators for non-residential construction. This is it. In order to understand organic growth in non-resi, you need to understand what drives it, and that's residential activity. So let's shift into our first income property type, retail. That's probably the most distinct link between residential and non-residential is retail, right? That single family development goes in, you need your Costco, you need your Starbucks, you need your Chick-fil-A, and depending on where you live, you get an edible shop, right? It's a budding industry, really. Certainly not going up in smoke. You know, we could totally turn this into a Cheech and Chong movie if we just, seriously though, there's a lot of edible shops going up. So I would call the declines that we've seen in the warehouse space over the last couple of years, I would say that's not economic, that's structural. Right, if you look at vacancy rates for warehouse, if you look at absorption in warehouse space, it's actually pretty decent. There's still a lot of demand for high-tech conditioned space in major transportation corridors around the country. Right, so this is a market that has just recalibrated around the big guy not being in the room anymore. Now, I would argue this is not a controversial forecast. I would argue, if anything, it's probably a conservative forecast. Yeah, Andrew is saying, yep. But I think what's going to happen here as we get past 2026 is we're going to hit a flat line. Why? It's not demand-based. Energy. Right? These things are exceptionally power hungry. How much fossil fuel generation construction is going on right now? Almost zero. Right? So at some point, people are just going to say, I can't build them anymore. It's much like a manufacturing plant. I can't build the manufacturing plant if I don't have workers to build it or to work in it. It's going to be the same thing here. And even if we do start to see in an environment with less regulatory burden, some of these fossil fuel plants starting to move forward, they take years to site and build. Not to mention just the legal landscape that they'll need to run through lawsuits, environmental lawsuits, to get them going. The other kind of nail in the coffin here in terms of getting this flatlined would be renewable. A lot of data centers try to power themselves with utility scale wind and solar, but if you think back to the UBA slide, UBA removed the investment tax credit and the production tax credit for utility scale renewables. So it makes utility scale renewables less positive. Right? So at some point here, we're just going to hit a ceiling until we can figure out the power generation side of data centers. But there's always a but. If you're in the Carolinas, if you're in Florida, go west to Texas. Anybody from California? Good, not you. Those population growth trends are actually very positive. You go to the Great Lakes, you go to New England, where I live, you go to the Mid-Atlantic, those population trends are very negative. So that shifts some markets here between growth and maybe not. So when we look at education construction then and we think about what's going to drive activity, I would put K through 12 growing faster than what you see on the graph here. But again, we mentioned the South and the West. Sorry, California, not you. I think a lot of that's new. Anybody know the average age of a school building, K through 12 building in the United States? Average age? Close, it's around 50. Yeah, 50 years old. So that's average. Think about what the building stock looks like in the Great Lakes, in New England, in the Mid-Atlantic, the older parts of the country. So what we're seeing there, even though the demographics aren't necessarily supported, what we're seeing in those areas of the country are renovation and replacement projects for 100 buildings that are 100 years old. So just because the demographics are weakening, it doesn't mean that education construction is dying. Right? What you need to do is map your exposure market by market, vertical by vertical, geography by geography. I also don't think trade disruption that we're seeing now creates losers. I think it creates opportunity, right? Because you're not the only one that's suffering maybe through this, so are your competitors, right? So this is an opportunity not just to map your own supply chain issues, but to map your competitors. Where are they exposed? And can you get into those markets and the verticals that they can't handle? And then finally, we talk about certainty. There are places you can find certainty in this uncertain market, and I just said it 3 times, public building construction. K through 12, some parts of college, hospitals, and even into things like fire stations, police stations. They're not sexy, but they're stable. And wait out the commercial recovery, the income side, right? But again, if we're thinking we're in September now and the income property recovery starts in about the midpoint of next year, what should you be doing with your marketing and business development plans, right? You need to be starting to plan for that recovery now rather than later. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.